The bustling airport terminal hummed with activity as travelers rushed to catch their flights. Amidst the chaos, one man stood out from the crowd. His weathered hands gripped a worn duffel bag, and his eyes, sharp and alert, scanned the departure board. This was James Carter, a 68-year-old retired Marine sergeant, about to embark on what should have been a routine flight home. James had seen his fair share of challenges in life, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq. He faced danger head-on and emerged stronger for it, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold at Gate 23. As he approached the gate, James noticed the first-class passengers being called to board. He glanced down at his ticket, double-checking the seat assignment. First class, 3A, a small luxury he'd decided to treat himself to after years of cramped economy seats. With a slight smile, he joined the line. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside," a voice cut through the air. James looked up to see a young flight attendant, her face a mask of polite indifference. First-class boarding only at this time. Confusion flickered across James' face. "I understand, ma'am. I have a first-class ticket right here." He held out his boarding pass, but the attendant barely glanced at it. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. Please wait for general boarding." A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others stared openly, curiosity and judgment in their eyes. James felt a familiar tightness in his chest, one he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform. "Ma'am, I don't understand. My ticket clearly states." The flight attendant cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. We have a full flight today, and we need to keep the boarding process moving." James stood there, rooted to the spot. He'd faced enemy fire, navigated minefields, and led men into battle. But in this moment, he felt utterly powerless. The weight of years of similar experiences pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. But James Carter was not a man easily defeated. As he watched the other first-class passengers file past, an idea began to form in his mind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad and pen, constant companions from his military days. With steady hands, he began to write. The words flowed onto the paper, carrying with them decades of pain, resilience, and hope. As he wrote, the noise of the airport faded away. In his mind, he was transported back to countless moments throughout his life. Moments of injustice, of struggle, but also of triumph and human kindness. Minutes ticked by, and finally, James looked up from his notepad. The general boarding had begun, and passengers streamed past him onto the plane. With a deep breath, he joined the line, his first-class ticket tucked away in his pocket. As he reached the entrance to the jet bridge, James found himself face to face with the same flight attendant. Her eyes widened in recognition, a flicker of unease crossing her face. But before she could speak, James held out the folded piece of paper. "I believe this belongs to you," he said quietly, his voice steady and calm. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment before accepting the note. As James continued down the jet bridge, he heard the rustle of paper being unfolded behind him. He didn't look back, but he could almost feel the weight of her gaze on his retreating form. What did James write in that note? What impact would his words have on the flight attendant, on the other passengers, on the airline itself? As he settled into his economy seat, surrounded by curious glances and whispered conversations, James closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. The engines roared to life, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. But for James, the journey had only just begun. His story, a tale of dignity in the face of discrimination, of wisdom born from a lifetime of experiences, was about to unfold in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As the plane lifted off the ground, carrying with it a cabin full of people from all walks of life, one question hung in the air. How can a single act of injustice lead to a moment of profound understanding? The answer lay in the carefully chosen words of a black veteran, scrawled on a simple piece of paper, now in the hands of a young flight attendant who had yet to fully grasp the power of her actions. The story of James Carter's flight was far from over. In fact, it was just taking off, ready to soar into unexpected territory. What happened next would challenge assumptions, open hearts, and remind us all of the ongoing struggle for equality and respect in a world that sometimes seems determined to divide us. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, leaving the familiar landscape behind, James felt a strange mix of emotions. There was anger, yes, and disappointment. But there was also a glimmer of hope. Hope that his words might make a difference, might cause someone to pause and reconsider their actions. Hope that his experience might spark a conversation, might lead to change, no matter how small. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began to settle in for the flight. But for James, and for the flight attendant now reading his note, the real journey was just beginning. A journey that would take them beyond the confines of this metal tube hurtling through the sky, into the complex landscape of human relationships, bias, and the potential for growth and understanding. What transformations would occur at 30,000 feet? What revelations awaited as the miles ticked by below? And most importantly, what would happen when the plane touched down and reality came rushing back in? The answers to these questions lay ahead, waiting to be discovered. But one thing was certain. This flight would be unlike any other, for James, the flight attendant, and for everyone else on board. Because sometimes it's not the destination that matters most, but the journey itself, and the unexpected connections we make along the way. As the plane leveled off and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, James settled back in his seat. He couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? How would his story unfold? And would his words, carefully crafted in a moment of quiet determination, have the power to change hearts and minds? The adventure was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the plane cruised at altitude, James Carter's mind drifted back to earlier that morning. He woken before dawn, his body still attuned to military time despite years of civilian life. The small apartment he called home was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street below. He'd packed his bag the night before, a habit ingrained from countless deployments. Everything had its place, neat and orderly. The first-class ticket lay on his bedside table, a gift from his daughter Sarah. "You deserve some comfort, Dad," she'd said when she presented it to him. "After all you've been through." James smiled at the memory as he sipped his morning coffee. Sarah had always been his rock, especially after her mother passed away. She'd inherited Marie's fierce determination and kind heart. It was Sarah who'd encouraged him to share his stories, to speak up about his experiences as a black veteran in America. As he dressed for the trip, pulling on a crisp button-down shirt and his most comfortable slacks, James caught sight of himself in the mirror. The face that looked back at him was lined with age and experience, but his eyes still held the same fire they had when he was a young Marine. He straightened his collar, a gesture that echoed the countless times he'd adjusted his uniform. The taxi ride to the airport had been uneventful, the driver chatting amiably about the unseasonably warm weather. James had responded politely, his mind already on the speaking engagement that awaited him at his destination. He was to address a group of young veterans, sharing his experiences and offering guidance on navigating life after service. Now, as the plane hummed around him, James couldn't help but wonder how his story would impact those young men and women. Would they face the same challenges he had? Would they encounter the same prejudices, the same closed doors? His thoughts were interrupted by movement in the aisle. The flight attendant who had denied him his rightful seat was making her way through the cabin, avoiding eye contact with James as she passed. He noticed her hands trembling slightly as she assisted another passenger with their luggage. What was going through her mind? James wondered. Had his note made an impact, or had she dismissed it without a second thought? He poured his heart into those words, drawing on a lifetime of similar encounters. He remembered the first time he'd faced such blatant discrimination in uniform. It was 1969, and he was on leave in a small town outside his base. Despite his crisp Marine Corps dress blues, he'd been refused service at a local diner. The memory still stung decades later. But James had also known kindness and solidarity. He thought of his platoon in Vietnam, a diverse group of men who'd formed an unbreakable bond in the face of adversity. Race hadn't mattered in the jungle, only trust and brotherhood. As the flight progressed, James noticed whispered conversations and curious glances directed his way. Word of what had happened at the gate seemed to have spread through the cabin. Some passengers looked sympathetic, others uncomfortable. A few seemed angry on his behalf. An elderly woman across the aisle caught his eye and gave him a small, encouraging smile. It reminded him of Marie and how she'd always been his strongest supporter. He felt a pang of loss, wishing she could have been here to see him speaking out, sharing their shared experiences with a new generation. Midway through the flight, a young man a few rows ahead turned and approached James. He looked nervous but determined. "Excuse me, sir, The young man said quietly, I couldn't help overhearing what happened earlier. I just wanted to say I'm sorry you had to go through that. It's not right. James was touched by the young man's sincerity. Thank you, he replied. It means a lot to hear that. The young man hesitated, then asked, If you don't mind me asking, what did you write in that note? James considered the question carefully. He poured his heart into those words, drawing on a lifetime of experiences both painful and profound. But they weren't meant for everyone's ears, at least not yet. I wrote what I felt needed to be said, James answered finally. Sometimes, the most powerful messages are the ones that make us uncomfortable, that challenge us to look at ourselves and our actions in a new light. The young man nodded thoughtfully. I hope it makes a difference, he said before returning to his seat. As the plane began its descent, James felt a mix of emotions. There was still anger at the injustice he faced, but also a glimmer of hope. Hope that his words might spark a change, however small. Hope that by sharing his story, he might make the path a little easier for those who came after him. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and passengers began preparing for landing. James noticed the flight attendant from earlier making her final checks. As she passed his row, their eyes met briefly. He saw confusion there, and something else, a hint of shame, perhaps, or the beginnings of understanding. Whatever the case, James knew this wasn't the end of the story. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, he felt a sense of anticipation. What would happen when they disembarked? Would there be consequences for the airline's actions? And how would this experience shape his upcoming talk with the young veterans? As passengers began to stand and gather their belongings, James remained seated, allowing others to pass. He was in no rush. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful statements were made through calm dignity in the face of injustice. Finally, as the cabin emptied, James stood and retrieved his duffel bag from the overhead compartment. He made his way slowly towards the exit, his mind already composing the words he would share with the young veterans awaiting him. At the door of the plane, he paused. The flight attendant stood there, her posture rigid, her eyes downcast. James could see his note, folded neatly, peeking out from her pocket. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words and lingering tension. Then, slowly, the flight attendant raised her eyes to meet his. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that neither James nor the flight attendant could have predicted. As he stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, James knew that his journey, and the impact of his carefully chosen words, was far from over. The story of the black veteran, the first-class seat, and the powerful note was about to take an unexpected turn, and as James made his way through the airport, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had been set in motion, something that might just have the power to change hearts, open minds, and bridge the divides that too often separated people. What awaited James beyond the airport doors? How would his experience on this flight shape his message to the young veterans? And what ripple effects would his actions have in the wider world? These questions hung in the air, unanswered but full of potential, as James stepped out into the bright sunlight of a new day. As James stepped into the bustling airport terminal, he felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. Word of the incident had spread like wildfire, and curious onlookers whispered and pointed in his direction. But James held his head high, walking with the quiet dignity that had carried him through decades of similar encounters. Suddenly, a commotion near the gate caught his attention. A group of passengers from his flight had gathered, their voices raised in anger. At the center of the storm stood the flight attendant, her face pale and her posture defensive. James hesitated, torn between the desire to continue on his way and a nagging sense that he should intervene. As he approached the group, he caught snippets of heated conversation. Its blatant discrimination. One passenger was saying, "We should file a formal complaint with the airline." Another chimed in. The flight attendant looked close to tears, overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught of criticism. James cleared his throat, and the crowd parted to let him through. He faced the flight attendant, aware that every eye was on them, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. But instead of anger or accusation, James's voice was calm and measured when he spoke. "I think," he said quietly, "that we all have an opportunity here. An opportunity to learn, to grow, and to do better." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. Even the flight attendant looked up, a mixture of surprise and relief in her eyes. What happened today was wrong, James continued. But pointing fingers and assigning blame won't solve the deeper issues at play. Instead, let's talk about how we can move forward, how we can ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else. As James spoke, he noticed a man in a crisp suit pushing through the crowd. The airline's logo was prominently displayed on his lapel pin, clearly a higher-up sent to damage control the situation. But before the man could interject, James held up a hand. Before we go any further, he said, I'd like to hear from the person at the center of this. Ma'am, he addressed the flight attendant directly. I'd like to know what you thought about the note I gave you. The flight attendant's hands trembled as she reached into her pocket and withdrew the folded paper. She took a deep breath, then began to read aloud, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger with each word. Dear Miss, she read, I want you to know that I see you. I see your youth, your potential, and the pressure you're under in a demanding job. I also want you to see me, not just the color of my skin, but the man beneath. A veteran who has served his country, a father, a widower, a human being deserving of respect. As she continued reading, tears began to roll down her cheeks. The crowd listened in stunned silence, many of them visibly moved by James's words of understanding and forgiveness in the face of discrimination. When she finished, the flight attendant looked up at James, her eyes brimming with a mix of shame and gratitude. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't realize. I never meant to. James nodded, acknowledging her apology without diminishing the impact of her actions. The question now, he said, addressing not just her but the entire gathered crowd, is what we do next. How do we turn this moment into lasting change? The airline representative stepped forward, clearly eager to contain the situation. Sir, he began, on behalf of the airline, I want to extend our deepest apologies. We would like to offer you compensation for your inconvenience and assure you that we take these matters very seriously. But James shook his head. I'm not interested in compensation, he said firmly. What I want is action. Real, meaningful changes to your training programs, your policies, and your corporate culture. Will you commit to that? The representative hesitated, clearly unprepared for this response. As he fumbled for words, a young woman pushed her way to the front of the crowd. I'm a journalist, she announced, holding up a press badge. And I think this is a story that needs to be told. Mr. Carter, would you be willing to go on record about your experiences? James considered her offer carefully. He had come to the airport prepared to share his story with a small group of veterans, but now he was faced with the opportunity to reach a much wider audience. Could this be the catalyst for real change? As he pondered his response, James noticed a group of uniformed soldiers watching the scene unfold from a distance. Their young faces reminded him of his own early days in the service, and of the hopes and dreams that had driven him to enlist. What would his younger self want him to do in this moment? The decision crystallized in his mind. Yes, he told the journalist, I'll tell my story, but not just my story, our story. The story of every person who's ever faced discrimination, who's ever been judged based on the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. As the words left his mouth, James felt a shift in the energy of the crowd. There was a sense of anticipation, of being on the cusp of something important. But he also knew that speaking out came with risks. How would his words be received? What backlash might he face? The airline representative was speaking again, making promises of internal reviews and diversity training. The flight attendant stood quietly, still clutching James's note, her expression a mix of remorse and determination. And all around them, passengers pulled out phones, recording the unfolding scene. In that moment, standing in the middle of the airport terminal, James realized that his journey had taken an unexpected turn. The speech he had prepared for the young veteran seemed a lifetime away. Instead, he found himself at the center of a storm, with the power to shape the narrative and potentially impact lives far beyond his original intentions. As the journalist began asking her first question, James took a deep breath. He thought of Marie, of Sarah, of all the men and women he had served with over the years. He thought of the countless others who had faced similar situations in silence. And he knew that what he said next had the potential to echo far beyond this airport, this city, this moment in time. The story of the black veteran, the denied seat, and the powerful note was about to reach a national audience. But as James began to speak, he couldn't help but wonder, Was the world truly ready to listen? And more importantly, was it ready to change? The airport terminal buzzed with nervous energy as James began recounting his story to the journalist. Phones recorded, passengers listened intently, and airline staff hovered nearby, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. James spoke with a measured calm, his words carrying the weight of decades of similar experiences. As he talked, a small crowd gathered around a nearby television. Breaking news banners flashed across the screen, and James' own face appeared, captured by someone's shaky cell phone footage. The story was spreading like wildfire, far beyond the confines of the airport. Midway through the interview, James's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. He glanced at the screen to see his daughter Sarah's name flashing. With an apologetic smile to the journalist, he answered the call. "Dad." Sarah's voice was tight with worry. "Are you okay? It's all over the news. They're saying you were discriminated against on your flight." James reassured his daughter, promising to call her back with details later. As he hung up, he noticed the airline representative engaged in a heated conversation on his own phone, gesturing frantically. The stakes were clearly rising by the minute. Suddenly, a commotion near the security checkpoint caught everyone's attention. A group of young veterans, the very ones James was supposed to address, had arrived at the airport. They'd seen the news and come to show their support. As they approached, their faces a mix of anger and determination, James felt a surge of emotion. These were the men and women he'd fought for, the future he'd hoped to shape. The lead veteran, a young woman with captain's bars on her uniform, stepped forward. "Sergeant Carter," she said, snapping to attention and saluting crisply. "We heard what happened. We're here to stand with you, sir." James returned the salute, his eyes misty. The gesture of solidarity, crossing generations and backgrounds, spoke volumes. As he introduced the young veterans to the gathered crowd, he could see the story taking on new dimensions in real time. The journalist's questions became more pointed, probing not just James' experience but the larger issues of systemic discrimination and the treatment of veterans. James answered thoughtfully, drawing on his years of service and life experience. With each response, he could feel the narrative shifting, expanding beyond a single incident to encompass a broader conversation about race, respect, and reconciliation in America. As the interview progressed, James noticed the flight attendant standing off to the side, still clutching his note. Her eyes never left him as he spoke, and he could see the impact his words were having. There was a growing realization in her expression, a dawning understanding of the larger context of her actions. Halfway through a particularly poignant answer about his experiences as a black soldier in Vietnam, James was interrupted by the arrival of more airline officials. A distinguished-looking woman in an impeccably tailored suit strode purposefully towards the group, flanked by a team of serious-faced individuals. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Amanda Reeves, CEO of the airline. I came as soon as I heard. On behalf of our entire organization, I want to express our deepest apologies for what you experienced today." A hush fell over the crowd. This was no longer just a local incident. It had escalated to the highest levels of corporate leadership. James shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the cameras capturing every moment of the interaction. "Miss Reeves," he replied, his voice steady, "I appreciate you coming in person, but I hope you understand that this isn't just about me or this one incident. It's about a systemic issue that affects countless individuals every day." The CEO nodded, her expression grave. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Carter. And that's why I'm here. We want to work with you to make real, lasting changes, not just in our airline, but in the industry as a whole." As she spoke, James caught sight of the young flight attendant. She had stepped forward, visibly gathering her courage. "Miss Reeves," she said, her voice shaky but determined. I'm the one who denied Mr. Carter his seat, and I want to be part of making those changes. I want to learn to do better." The CDO turned to the flight attendant, surprise evident on her face. The cameras swiveled, capturing this unexpected development. James watched the scene unfold, sensing that they were on the cusp of a pivotal moment. But before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "James Carter? Is that really you?" James turned to see an elderly man making his way through the crowd, leaning heavily on a cane. As he got closer, James's eyes widened in recognition. It was Tom Bradshaw, his old platoon sergeant from Vietnam. They hadn't seen each other in over 40 years. "Tom," James said, disbelief coloring his voice. "What are you doing here?" Tom's weathered face broke into a grin. "Saw you on the news. Couldn't believe my eyes. Told my grandson to drive me down here right away. Couldn't let my old friend face this alone." As the two veterans embraced, the reunion captured by dozens of cameras, James felt the story taking yet another turn. Here was living proof of the bonds forged in service, transcending time and race. The journalist's eyes gleamed with the realization that her story had just gained another compelling layer. The CEO watched the reunion with a mix of surprise and calculation, clearly reassessing her approach, and the young veteran stood at attention, witnessing a powerful moment of history intersecting with the present. In that charged moment, with cameras rolling and the world watching, James knew that his next words would be crucial. The story had grown far beyond a denied airline seat. It had become a flashpoint for discussions about race, respect, corporate responsibility, and the treatment of veterans. As all eyes turned to him, waiting to hear what he would say next, James took a deep breath. He thought of Marie, of Sarah, of his years of service, and of all those who had faced similar injustices in silence. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he stood tall, ready to speak his truth. The terminal fell silent, the usual airport chaos fading into the background. In this suspended moment, filled with tension and possibility, James prepared to address not just the gathered crowd, but a nation grappling with its past and its future. What would he say? How would his words shape the unfolding narrative? And most importantly, what impact would this moment have on the ongoing struggle for equality and respect? As James opened his mouth to speak, the world held its breath, waiting to see how this extraordinary story would unfold. As James opened his mouth to speak, a commotion erupted near the airport's main entrance. A group of protesters had gathered, their chants growing louder by the second. "No more discrimination," they shouted, waving hastily made signs. The crowd in the terminal shifted nervously, unsure of how this new development would unfold. James exchanged a worried glance with Tom. They had seen how quickly situations like this could escalate. The airline CEO, Ms. Reeves, stepped forward, her face tight with concern. "Mr. Carter," she said urgently, "perhaps we should move this conversation to a more private location." But before James could respond, a familiar face pushed through the crowd. It was Sarah, his daughter, her eyes blazing with a mixture of worry and determination. "Dad," she called out, rushing to his side, "I couldn't just sit at home watching this on TV. I had to be here." As Sarah reached him, James felt a surge of emotion. His little girl, now a strong woman, standing beside him in this moment of crisis. He squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her presence. The journalist, sensing the story taking yet another dramatic turn, raised her microphone. "Mr. Carter," she said, "how do you respond to the protesters? Do you support their actions?" James took a deep breath, aware that his words now carried even more weight. But as he began to speak, he was interrupted by a sharp cry from the back of the crowd. "He doesn't speak for all of us." The crowd parted to reveal a middle-aged man in a business suit, his face flushed with anger. "I'm tired of everything being turned into a race issue," he shouted. "What about reverse discrimination? What about merit?" A murmur ran through the crowd. The protesters outside grew louder, having caught wind of the confrontation inside. The airport security staff began to look nervous, speaking urgently into their radios. James felt the situation balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong word could tip this into chaos. He looked at Sarah, saw the fear in her eyes, and knew he had to find a way to diffuse the tension. Just then, the young flight attendant stepped forward, her voice shaky but determined. "Please," she said, addressing the angry man, "listen to what Mr. Carter has to say. I was wrong today, and I'm learning from it. We all need to listen and learn." Her words seemed to take the wind out of the man's sails. He fell silent, though his face remained stormy. James nodded gratefully to the flight attendant, seeing her in a new light. As he turned back to address the crowd, James caught sight of Tom. His old friend was watching the scene unfold with a look of grim recognition. They had faced similar tensions decades ago, in a different time and place, but the core issues remained the same. Taking a deep breath, James began to speak. "I understand the anger," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the terminal. "On all sides. I've felt it myself, more times than I can count. but anger alone won't solve anything. He paused, looking around at the diverse faces in the crowd. What happened to me today isn't just about one seat on one flight. It's about a history of injustice, yes, but it's also about the possibility of change. As James continued, weaving together his personal experience with the larger issues at play, something remarkable began to happen. The angry voices quieted, people leaned in to listen. Even the protesters outside seemed to sense the shift, their chants fading to a murmur. But just as it seemed James might be reaching a breakthrough, a new voice cut through the crowd. "James Carter?" The voice was frail but insistent. "Is that little Jimmy Carter?" James turned, stunned to see an elderly white woman making her way towards him, leaning heavily on a walker. It took him a moment to place her, but when he did, his eyes widened in shock. "Mrs. Thompson?" he whispered. Sarah looked at her father in confusion. "Dad, who is that?" James's voice was thick with emotion when he answered. "That's Mrs. Thompson. She was my third-grade teacher. The first person who ever told me I could be anything I wanted to be." As Mrs. Thompson reached them, James bent down to embrace her frail form. The old woman's eyes were filled with tears. "Oh, Jimmy," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed terminal. "I always knew you'd do great things, but I never imagined it would be like this." The reunion of the black veteran and his white former teacher, separated by decades but united in this moment, sent a ripple through the crowd. Phones came out, capturing the moment. The journalist's eyes gleamed, recognizing the powerful symbolism of the scene. But as James straightened up, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Through the airport windows, he could see police cars arriving, lights flashing. The protesters outside were growing louder again, pushing against the airport doors. In that moment, James realized that his words alone might not be enough to contain the situation. The story had grown beyond his control, touching on deep-seated issues that had simmered for generations. As he looked from Mrs. Thompson to Sarah, from Tom to the young flight attendant, he knew that what happened next would have consequences far beyond this one day, this one airport. The CEO stepped forward again, her face grave. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "I think we need to make a decision, right now." James nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. But as he opened his mouth to respond, a new sound cut through the tension. A child's voice, high and clear, singing an old civil rights anthem. Heads turned, searching for the source. And there, standing on a chair, was a young boy no more than 10 years old. His small voice grew stronger as others began to join in, a familiar melody spreading through the crowd like a wave. As the song swelled, James felt a shift in the energy of the room. This was no longer just his story. It had become something larger, a moment of reckoning and potential healing. But how would it end? The next few minutes would determine whether this would be remembered as a day of division or a turning point towards understanding. With all eyes on him once again, James took a deep breath. The world was watching, waiting to see how this extraordinary story would unfold. And in that charged moment, filled with both peril and possibility, James Carter prepared to make the most important speech of his life. As the child's song faded, a hush fell over the crowded terminal. James Carter stood tall, his weathered face a map of determination and hope. He looked at the faces around him, Sarah, Tom, Mrs. Thompson, the young flight attendant, the airline CEO, the angry businessman, the protesters outside, and saw in them the complexity of America itself. "Today," James began, his voice strong and clear, "we stand at a crossroads. Not just in this airport, but as a nation. What happened to me on that plane isn't unique. It's a story as old as our country. But how we respond to it, that's the story we get to write today." As he spoke, James noticed movement at the edges of the crowd. Airport security was trying to hold back the surge of protesters who had managed to push through the doors. The tension in the air was palpable, threatening to overshadow his words. But James pressed on, his voice rising above the commotion. "I've served this country, bled for it, watched good men and women of all colors die for it. And I've also felt the sting of its shortcomings, but I've never lost faith in what we can be when we see each other as human beings first." He turned to the young flight attendant, who stood nervously nearby. "This young woman made a mistake today, a hurtful one, yes, but she's willing to learn from it, to do better. Isn't that what we all need to do?" The flight attendant stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice shaky but determined, I want to do more than apologize. I want to make this right, not just for you, but for everyone who's ever felt discriminated against." A murmur ran through the crowd. The airline CEO, sensing a moment of opportunity, stepped up. "Mr. Carter, we'd like to offer you a position as a diversity and inclusion consultant for our airline. Help us make real, lasting changes." For a moment, James was tempted. It was a chance to make a difference, to turn his painful experience into something positive. But as he opened his mouth to accept, he caught sight of the young veteran standing at attention nearby, and a different idea took shape. "Thank you, Ms. Reeves," he said, "but I have a counter-proposal. Instead of hiring me, I want you to create a scholarship program for young people from underprivileged backgrounds who dream of becoming pilots, flight attendants, engineers. Let's change the face of this industry from the ground up." A cheer went up from the crowd, drowning out the protests from outside. The CEO, caught off guard but clearly impressed, nodded her agreement. But James wasn't finished. He turned to the angry businessman who had spoken out earlier. "Sir," he said, extending his hand, "I'd like to invite you to sit down with me. Not to argue, but to listen. To share our stories, because that's how we bridge these divides, one conversation at a time." The man hesitated, then slowly reached out to shake James's hand. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt monumental. As the tension in the terminal began to ease, Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her eyes twinkling. "Jimmy," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I always knew you'd teach us all a lesson someday. I just didn't know it would be like this." Laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking the last of the tension. Even the protesters outside seemed to sense the shift, their chants fading to a murmur. But just as it seemed the story was reaching its resolution, Sarah gasped, pointing at one of the airport TV screens. Breaking news banners flashed across the bottom. "Exclusive. Long-lost footage of James Carter's heroic actions in Vietnam surfaces." The terminal fell silent as grainy footage began to play. It showed a young James Carter, in the heat of battle, risking his life to save fellow soldiers, both black and white. The date stamp showed it was from one of the most racially tense periods of the war. As the footage played, Tom stepped forward, his voice choked with emotion. "I remember that day," he said. "James saved my life, and I never properly thanked him because I was too proud to admit a black man had saved me." The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. Here was tangible proof of James's lifetime of service, of his commitment to looking beyond race even in the most challenging circumstances. The airline CEO, seizing the moment, announced on the spot that the scholarship program would be named in James's honor. The young flight attendant, inspired by James' example, declared her intention to be the program's first volunteer mentor. As the crowd erupted in cheers, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see a young boy, the same one who had started singing earlier. "Mr. Carter," the boy said, his eyes wide with admiration, "when I grow up, I want to be just like you." James knelt down to the boy's level, aware of the cameras capturing the moment but focused solely on the child before him. "You can be even better," he said softly. "Just remember, it's not about black or white. It's about right and wrong, and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." As James stood, he was engulfed in a group hug. Sarah, Tom, Mrs. Thompson, the young veterans, and even the once angry businessman joining in. The crowd's cheers grew louder, drowning out the last echoes of protest from outside. In that moment, surrounded by a tapestry of faces that represented the best of America, James Carter realized that his journey had come full circle. From a young boy dreaming of flying planes to a veteran fighting for his country, from a man denied his rightful seat to a catalyst for change, his story had become a testament to the power of resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring hope for a better tomorrow. As the cameras flashed and reporters clamored for comments, James smiled, knowing that while this chapter of his story might be ending, the ripples of change it had set in motion were only just beginning. In an airport terminal on an ordinary day, an extraordinary transformation had taken place, not just for one man or one airline, but for all those touched by the power of understanding and the courage to stand up for what's right. In the days that followed, James Carter's story spread far beyond the confines of that airport terminal. News outlets across the country picked up the tale of the black veteran denied his seat, the powerful note that changed hearts, and the unexpected reunion that sparked a movement. Social media buzzed with discussions, hashtags trended, and people from all walks of life shared their own experiences of discrimination and hope for change. The airline, true to its word, launched the James Carter Scholarship Program with an initial fund of $5 million. Applications poured in from young people across the country, each dream taking flight on the wings of opportunity. James found himself working closely with the airline's HR department, sharing his insights and experiences to help shape a more inclusive corporate culture. The young flight attendant, Jessica, became an unexpected champion for change within the company. She spoke openly about her mistake and the lessons she'd learned, her honesty inspiring others to confront their own biases. Her journey from that fateful day to becoming a mentor in the scholarship program became a story of redemption that resonated with many. Tom Bradshaw, James' old platoon sergeant, made good on his promise to finally share the full story of James's heroism in Vietnam. His account, coupled with the resurfaced footage, led to a grassroots campaign to have James's military honors reviewed. Months later, in a ceremony that brought tears to the eyes of all who attended, James was awarded the Medal of Honor that had been overlooked decades ago. Mrs. Thompson, James's third-grade teacher, became a media sensation in her own right. Her unwavering belief in her students, regardless of their race, struck a chord with educators across the nation. She was invited to speak at teachers' conferences, sharing her wisdom and inspiring a new generation of educators to see the potential in every child. The angry businessman who had confronted James in the airport, Michael Donovan, underwent a transformation of his own. True to his word, James met with him several times in the months that followed. Their conversations, sometimes heated but always honest, led Michael to reevaluate his perspectives. He eventually became an advocate for diversity in his own company, often citing his experience with James as a turning point in his life. Sarah, James's daughter, found her own voice strengthened by the events. She started a blog chronicling her father's story and the changes it was inspiring. Her thoughtful posts on race, respect, and reconciliation garnered a following of their own, and she soon found herself invited to speak at colleges and community events alongside her father. The young boy who had sung in the airport and told James he wanted to be like him when he grew up became a symbol of hope for the future. His name was Elijah, and his parents' video of him singing went viral. James made sure to keep in touch with the family, becoming a mentor to Elijah and watching with pride as the boy's dreams of becoming a pilot began to take shape. As for James himself, he found his retirement taking an unexpected turn. Instead of quiet days and occasional speaking engagements, he was now at the forefront of a national conversation on race and reconciliation. He appeared on talk shows, wrote op-eds for major newspapers, and was invited to speak at corporate events and universities across the country. But of all the changes and opportunities that came his way, James found the most satisfaction in the small, personal interactions. Like the day he received a letter from a young airman who had been inspired by his story to report discrimination in his unit. Or the elderly woman who approached him in a grocery store to share her own story of facing prejudice and finding the courage to stand up against it. 6 months after that fateful flight, James found himself back at the same airport, this time as an honored guest. The airline was unveiling a new training center named after him, dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion in the aviation industry. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, airline employees, media, and members of the public, James felt the weight of the moment. "When I was a young boy," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I dreamed of flying. Not just in planes, but above the prejudices and limitations that society tried to place on me. Today, we're not just opening a building. We're opening doors of opportunity for every child who dares to dream, regardless of the color of their skin." As applause filled the air, James caught sight of familiar faces in the crowd. There was Jessica, the flight attendant, standing tall and proud in her uniform. Tom and Mrs. Thompson sat side by side, their faces beaming with pride. Michael Donovan was there too, nodding along with James's words. And in the front row, Sarah sat with young Elijah on her lap, the boy's eyes wide with wonder. After the ceremony, as James mingled with the guests, a reporter approached him. "Mr. Carter," she said, "your story has inspired so many. What's next for you?" James smiled, his eyes twinkling. I thought I was ready to retire, but life had other plans. What's next is what's always been there, the work of making this country live up to its promises. One conversation, one action, one day at a time. As the event wound down, James found a quiet moment with Sarah and Elijah. The boy looked up at him, his face serious. "Mr. Carter," he said, "do you think one day people won't be mean to each other because of how they look?" James knelt down to Elijah's level, just as he had done in the airport months ago. "I believe that day will come, Elijah, and it'll be because of kids like you who grow up knowing that what matters most is not the color of our skin, but the content of our character." Sarah squeezed her father's shoulder, her eyes glistening with tears. "Dad," she said softly, "Mom would be so proud of you." James felt a lump in his throat as he thought of Marie, how he wished she could have seen all of this. But in a way, he knew she had been with him every step of this journey. As they walked out of the training center, James paused to look back at the building bearing his name. It wasn't just a structure of steel and glass. It was a symbol of progress, of hope, of the long arc of history bending towards justice. And while he knew there was still much work to be done, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turn his life had taken. The sun was setting as they reached the parking lot, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. James thought back to that day on the plane, the hurt and anger he had felt, the note he had written. He could never have imagined where that moment would lead. As he opened the car door for Sarah and Elijah, a plane took off overhead, its engines roaring with promise. James watched it climb into the sky, carrying with it the dreams and stories of hundreds of passengers. He smiled, knowing that thanks to the changes set in motion by his experience, those journeys would be a little more just, a little more kind. "Ready to go home, Dad?" Sarah asked, buckling Elijah into his car seat. James nodded, sliding into the passenger seat. "Home," he said, "and then wherever this journey takes us next." As they drove away from the airport, James Carter felt a deep sense of peace. His story, of injustice faced and overcome, of the power of words to change hearts, of the strength found in unity, had become part of a larger narrative. A narrative of a nation still striving to fulfill its promise of equality and justice for all. And as the airport faded from view in the rearview mirror, James knew that while this chapter might be ending, the story, his story, our story, would continue. In classrooms and boardrooms, in homes and in the halls of power, the conversation he had started would go on. And with each retelling, with each life touched, the world would inch a little closer to the dream of a truly equal society. James closed his eyes, listening to Sarah and Elijah chat happily in the background. He thought of Marie, of his long-ago third-grade classroom, of jungles in Vietnam and busy airport terminals. A lifetime of moments, all leading to this. And as the car carried them home, James Carter smiled, thankful for the journey and hopeful for the road ahead.